Let us begin with a short political story. You live in a small village with a crime problem. Vandals roam the village, stealing and destroying property. No one seems to be doing anything about it. So one day, you take your guns and go looking for vandals. Periodically, you catch one, take him back to your house at gunpoint, and lock him in the basement. You provide the prisoners with food so they don't starve, but you plan to keep them locked in the basement for a few years to teach them a lesson. After operating in this way for a few weeks, you decide to make the rounds of the neighborhood, starting with your next-door neighbor. As he answers the door, you ask, "Have you noticed the reduction in crime in the last weeks?" He nods. "Well, that is thanks to me." You explain your anti-crime program. Noting the wary look on your neighbor's face, you continue. "Anyway, I'm here because it's time to collect your contribution to the Crime Prevention Fund. Your bill for the month is $100. As your neighbor stares at you, making no apparent move to hand over the money, you patiently explain that should he refuse to make the required payment, you will unfortunately have to label him a criminal, at which point he will be subject to long-term confinement in your basement, along with the aforementioned vandals. Indicating the pistol at your hip, you note that you are prepared to take him by force if necessary. Supposing you take this tack with all of your neighbors, what sort of reception could you expect? Would most cheerfully give over their assigned share of the costs of crime prevention? Not likely. In all probability, you would observe the following. First, almost none would agree that they owe you anything. While some might pay up for fear of imprisonment in your basement and a few might pay up out of hostility toward the vandals, almost none would consider themselves duty-bound to do so. Those who refuse to pay would more likely be praised than condemned for standing up to you. Second, most would consider your actions outrageous. Your demands for payment would be condemned as naked extortion, and your confinement of those who refuse to pay as kidnapping. The very outrageousness of your conduct, combined with your deluded presumption that the rest of the village would recognize an obligation to support you, would cause many to question your sanity. What does this story have to do with political philosophy? In the story, you behaved like a rudimentary government. Though you did not take on all the functions of a typical modern state, you assumed two of its most central roles. You punished people who violated others' rights or disobeyed your commands, and you collected non-voluntary contributions to finance your activities. In the case of the government, these activities are referred to as the criminal justice system and the tax system. In your case, they are referred to as kidnapping and extortion. On the face of it, your activities are of the same kind as those of a government. Yet most people's evaluations of the government are far more lenient than their evaluations of you in the story. Most people support the state's imprisonment of criminals, feel obligated to pay their taxes, and consider punishment of tax evaders both desirable and within the rights of the state. This illustrates a general feature of our attitudes toward government. Governments ethically considered are permitted to do things that no non-governmental person or organization may do. At the same time, individuals are thought to have obligations to their governments that they would owe to no non-governmental persons or organization. The point is that our ethical judgments sharply differ between governmental and non-governmental actions. Action that would be considered morally abhorrent are considered acceptable when performed by the state. What is the moral thinking that differentiates your actions in the above story from the actions of a government? Broadly speaking, two sorts of explanations could be given. One type of explanation is that despite appearances, the two behaviors are different, that the government is not really doing the same thing as the vigilante. For instance, suppose one thought the crucial difference was that the vigilante does not give the vandals fair jury trials, as the government in some countries does to those it seeks to punish. That could explain why the vigilantes' behavior is less legitimate than that of the government. But suppose using threats of fines or imprisonment in your basement, you also forced a group of neighbors to sit through a trial to decide on the guilt of your prisoners. Would this now be morally justified? The other type of explanation is that the two agents are different. That is, the government may be doing the same things as the vigilante, but who is doing it makes all the difference. You are to be condemned in the story, not because you're doing something morally wrong, but because you're acting like a government, though you're not the government, and have not been elected to carry out such actions. To this, suppose you and a group of 6 work colleagues go to a meal and drinks. During this, the conversation moves on to the pay you all receive. It turns out you make by far the most money. Everyone at the meal agrees you make too much and should give a large amount to charity. As they sit around the table, they all take a vote on whether they should make you give to charity. With the exception of you, the vote passes all in favor. Now that it has been decided on democratically, do you have an obligation to pay? And do your colleagues have the moral right to use force to make you pay? Assuming you answered no to this question, how many people would have to agree to the use of force to take your money before it would be morally justified? 100, 1,000, 100,000, 1 million? Or would it never be justified at all? The definition of the state is whichever group is able to successfully establish and maintain a monopoly over the use of violence in a given territory. This promise of violence yet to be committed is the foundation of all laws. So if you personally do not have the moral right to use violence, do you have the right to employ someone to commit that violence on your behalf? This is the problem of political authority.